Open the file. 10 women, 1 killer, 30 years. This is the case that Korea could not solve. Police questioned more than 21,000 suspects. They fingerprinted over 40,000 people. They spent more than 2 million working days on it. The largest manhunt in the nation's history. And the whole time, the man they were hunting was hiding in plain sight. He felt no fear. He lived an ordinary life. And when they finally found him, he said he was surprised it took so long. This is the story of the Hwaseong serial murders. But more than that, it's the story of how a killer can look exactly like everyone else. Let's start with the place, Hwaseong, in Gyeonggi Province, just south of Seoul. Today it's a developed city. In the 1980s, it was farmland, rice paddies to the horizon, narrow dirt roads, houses with no streetlights. After dark, the fields went completely black. And here's a detail that matters for understanding the killer. South Korea in this era had almost no forensic science, no DNA database, no cameras, no phones to trace. A careful man could move through these villages like a ghost. The killer understood this. He used it. That's the first thing the case tells us about him. He wasn't impulsive. He was patient. Between September 1986 and April 1991, 10 women were murdered here. The youngest was a schoolgirl of 13. The oldest, a woman of 71. Think about who they were before they were case numbers. A grandmother walking home from a relative's house. A young factory worker finishing a late shift, taking the road she took every night. A teenage girl, almost home. They had families waiting. They had ordinary plans for the next morning. They had nothing in common except this. They were female, and they were alone in the dark. The killer didn't choose them for who they were. He chose them for when and where they were. And that tells us something colder than rage. This was method, not passion. It began in September 1986. The first victim, a woman in her 70s, found in a field. To police, it looked like one terrible, isolated crime. They had no reason yet to imagine what was coming. But weeks later, it happened again. And then again. A second victim, a third. Each found in the same kind of place, a field, a ditch, the edge of a paddy. Each killed the same way. Look at the pattern in the file. The hands bound. The victim's own clothing used to strangle her. The same signature, again and again. To an investigator, a repeating signature means one thing. The same hand. The same mind. And this mind was in no hurry. He took his time at each scene. He left almost nothing the technology of the day could read. Here's the question that would haunt the investigation for 30 years. If he left so little, how do you catch a man who is, in every other way, invisible? As the bodies kept appearing, fear took hold of Hwaseong. Women stopped going out after dark. Factories shifted their hours, so female workers wouldn't walk home at night. Fathers and brothers escorted the women and their families everywhere. A whole region living under one shadow, waiting to learn who was next. And the fear didn't stay local. It became national news, a serial killer operating freely in a country that had never really seen one. South Korea was facing a kind of crime it had no playbook for. Now we come to the part of this story that is hardest to watch. The police response was massive, but it was also desperate. Investigators were under crushing pressure to produce a suspect. Any suspect. And the methods of the 1980s were blunt. A confession was often the goal, and the rules around how a confession was obtained were not always clean. Remember this, because it's about to destroy an innocent man's life. But first, the near miss. In one case, a victim survived. She gave a description. From it, police built a composite sketch, the face of a young man, ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of face you'd forget. That sketch went everywhere. Millions of people studied it. His own neighbors may have looked right at it. And nobody recognized him. Sit with that. The most wanted face in the country, and it was too ordinary to see. The numbers grew staggering. 2 million working days, 21,000 suspects, 40,000 fingerprints, the largest criminal investigation in South Korean history. And case after case, the trail went cold. Then came the 8th case, and inside it, a second tragedy. In the 8th murder, the victim was a young girl. Under enormous pressure, police arrested a local man named Yoon. They labeled this one a copycat, separate from the rest. and they got their confession. But Yoon was innocent. The confession had come out of conditions that should never produce one. He was convicted anyway. Sentenced to life, he would serve nearly 20 years for a murder he did not commit. Now hold both of these truths at once. An innocent man, locked away, paying for the crime, and the real killer, still free, still out there, watching the investigation chase the wrong man. The system hadn't just failed to catch him. It had punished someone else in his place. The killings went on, a 9th victim, a 10th, and then, in April 1991, the last murder in the series. After that, nothing. The attack simply stopped. For the detectives, that silence was its own torment. No confrontation, no arrest, no answer. Just an absence, as if the killer had vanished. Here's the open question they couldn't answer for decades. Why would a patient compulsive killer suddenly completely stop? Killers like this don't usually quit. So what happened to him? Hold that question. The answer is almost unbearably simple. The years passed. The case went cold, then colder. It became the great unsolved crime of modern Korea. The one every detective knew, the one that followed them into retirement. Men spent entire careers on it and grew old without ever learning his name. In 2003, director Bong Joon-ho made it into a film, Memories of Murder, one of the most acclaimed Korean films ever made. And it ends deliberately, without an answer. The detective stares straight into the camera, into the audience, as if scanning the crowd for the killer who might be watching. Because in real life, that's exactly where it stood. No answer, no name. Just a question left hanging. Until, decades later, it wasn't. By 2019, forensic science had transformed. DNA analysis could now read a profile from old degraded evidence. And crucially, investigators had kept that evidence, clothing from the victims, preserved in storage for over 30 years. In a renewed effort, they sent it for modern DNA testing, and this time they got a match. The DNA matched a man already in the National Offender Database, a man who was already in prison. His name was Lee Choon-jae, and now you'll understand why the murders stopped. Lee had been behind bars since 1994, not for Hwaseong, for a different crime. In 1994, in the city of Cheongju, he raped and murdered his own sister-in-law. For that, he was convicted and given a life sentence. That's why the killings ended in 1991. Not conscience, not reform, not death. He was simply locked up for something else. For nearly 25 years, the most hunted man in Korean history sat quietly in a cell, and no one connected him to the case that terrorized a nation. The answer to the great mystery was just paperwork no one had cross-checked. Investigators matched his DNA to one victim, then another, then a third. The connection was undeniable. They went to confront him, and here the case becomes a study in psychology. At first, Lee denied everything. Calmly, flatly. In prison, those who knew him described a model inmate, quiet, cooperative, polite. The exact same ordinariness that hid him for decades. There was no monster on the surface. That was the disguise. Investigators kept returning, kept laying out the evidence, and slowly, the denials gave way. Then Lee Choon-jae began to talk. What he confessed to went far past anything he'd been charged with. All 10 Hwaseong murders. He admitted them. But he didn't stop there. 14 killings in total, including 4 no one had ever linked to him, and dozens of rapes on top of that. He described details only the killer could know. Details held back from the public for decades, and listen to how he talked about it. Without panic, without remorse. When asked how he'd evaded capture so long, he reportedly said he was surprised he wasn't caught sooner. Not relief, not guilt. Mild surprise. That flatness, that absence of emotion, is the most chilling part of this entire case. He had carried these murders for 30 years the way you'd carry an old forgotten errand. And then there was the 8th case, the copycat. The one Yoon had served nearly 20 years for. Lee confessed to that one too. That confession forced a reckoning. Yoon's case was reopened. In a retrial, the court formally cleared his name. After 2 decades in prison for Lee's crime, Yoon was, at last, declared innocent. Justice of a kind. But it could not return the years that were taken. And now the cruelest turn in the whole story. For all of it, the 10 murders, the terror, the wasted manhunt, the innocent man imprisoned, Lee Choon-jae would never be charged for the Hwaseong killings. By the time his DNA named him in 2019, the statute of limitations had already expired. Under the law as it stood when the murders happened, too much time had passed. The clock had run out years before. They could name him. They could prove it beyond doubt. But they could not put him on trial for a single one of those 10 lives. He remains in prison today. But only for the 1994 murder of his sister-in-law. For the 10 women of Hwaseong, for their families, there would be no verdict, no sentence, no day in court, only a name, arriving 30 years too late. The fields of Hwaseong are gone now. Where dark paddies once stretched into the night, there are apartments, streetlights, traffic. A city grown up over the places where the bodies were found. The town moved on. The country moved on. But the case left scars that never faded. For 30 years, 10 families waited for an answer they were told might never come. And when it finally came, it came with a bitter edge. The truth. But not justice. This case changed South Korea. It drove the country to abolish the statute of limitations on murder, so that no future killer could simply outlast the clock. It exposed, through Yoon, how a desperate investigation can destroy an innocent life, and it left a permanent question in the nation's memory. How many monsters are hiding behind a perfectly ordinary face? Some cases are solved, some are punished. This one was only named. I'm telling the stories the rest of the world never heard. If you want the next file, subscribe. It's already open.